In the heart of Mississippi in 1849, where cotton grew higher than the dreams of free men and the Mississippi River carried more sorrow than water, there existed a story that official records never dared to record. The riverside mansion, with its white columns and fragrant gardens, was the scene of what newspapers of the day called an unexplainable family tragedy, a wedding feast that turned into a collective mourning. On a single night in January, 17 members of Warren County's most prominent families fell to a slow and painful death, their faces twisted into expressions doctors could not understand. What they did not realize was that the truth rested in the calloused hands of a woman who had lost everything, yet discovered something far more powerful, the patience to deliver justice on the finest plate society had ever known. This is the story of Celia, a cook who turned spices into vengeance and recipes into instruments of retribution. A woman who chose her own surname when she decided she would no longer belong to anyone else. Before we continue, share where you are watching from and whether this is your first time on our channel. And remember to subscribe for more tales that formal history preferred to ignore. The Riverside Plantation spanned over 2,000 acres along the muddy banks of the Mississippi. Its endless rows of cotton moved like a white sea under the scorching summer sun of 1848. It was among Warren County's wealthiest estates, renowned not only for the quality of its harvest, but also for the grandeur of its main house and especially for the excellence of its meals. Colonel James Riverside had inherited the property from his father, and expanded it with the same calculated ruthlessness that marked men of his rank. Tall, thin as a whip, with eyes the shade of winter ice, he commanded his 340 slaves with an iron hand disguised in a velvet glove. He firmly believed that strict discipline, balanced with small privileges, preserved order better than outright brutality. Yet, the jewel of his estate was not the cotton fields but the culinary fame that drew visitors from neighboring plantations. Politicians from Jackson, merchants navigating the Mississippi, and planters from nearby counties eagerly accepted invitations to riverside dinners. The secret behind this fame rested in the hands of a woman few guests ever saw, yet whose skill everyone savored. Celia had arrived at the plantation as a child in 1829, part of a group of slaves bought from a bankrupt property in South Carolina. She was just 8 years old, with large, curious eyes and an extraordinary memory for flavors and scents. The head cook, an elderly woman called Mama Ruth, quickly recognized the girl's natural gift and took her under her wing. For 16 years, Celia learned not just to cook, but to understand the secrets of spices, the science of fermentation, and the mysteries of herbs that grew wild near the swamps. Mama Ruth, brought from Africa as a young woman, carried ancestral knowledge of medicinal plants and their uses. She taught Celia that every leaf, root, and seed served a purpose. Some healed, some caused sleep, and others, well, some purposes were better left unspoken. Mama Ruth would say as they dried herbs under the moon that their people had known the earth's secrets long before ships, long before chains. This knowledge ran in their blood, passed from mother to daughter, an inheritance that could never be stolen. Mama Ruth also taught Celia something equally priceless, reading and writing. During long winter nights when the kitchen was quieter, she showed the girl how to form letters in the sand, how to read words in the main house's recipe books, and how to record her discoveries about plants in secret. The old cook emphasized that knowledge was the only inheritance that could not be taken away. If Celia could read, she could learn anything. If she could write, she could leave her mark in the world, even when others treated her as invisible. When Mama Ruth died of fever in 1845, Celia naturally took her place as head cook. She was 24 years old, married to a blacksmith named Samuel, and mother to 3 children. Thomas, born in 1841, Mary, born in 1842, and little David, born in 1844. The family lived in a cabin slightly larger than the others, a privilege granted because of Celia's vital role in the household's reputation. Colonel Riverside rarely spoke directly to her, communicating demands through his wife Rosalind, a pale and anxious woman who spent her days embroidering and taking medicines for her nerves. Rosalind planned menus for special occasions, consulting a recipe book inherited from her mother-in-law. But it was Celia who transformed those instructions into edible works of art. The main house kitchen was Celia's domain, spacious, with a large iron stove and multiple ovens, shelves stocked with spices from distant lands via river trade, and a pantry rivaling those of urban hotels. It was her kingdom. She led 6 assistants, all young women she had trained herself. Each had her specialty. Sarah handled breads and sweets, Hannah prepared meats, and Lily managed preserves and pickles. Yet Celia kept the most critical secrets to herself. She alone prepared the special sauces that left guests in awe, knew precisely how long to smoke the ham for perfect texture, and combined herbs to turn a simple chicken broth into something unforgettable. Celia's children lived in the quarters with the other children, but sometimes came to the kitchen when she needed to watch them while working. Thomas, 7 years old in 1848, already showed interest in learning his father's trade at the forge, and often accompanied him when kitchen duties allowed. Mary, 6 years old, shared her mother's curiosity about plants, occasionally joining her during herb collection near the quarters. Little David, 4, was content playing with corn dolls Celia made for him in her rare free moments. Life on the plantation followed a predictable rhythm, and within the limits of slavery it was relatively stable. Celia had found a way to shield her family through her indispensable role. The colonel would never sell the cook who ensured his social standing, and thus would never separate her family. It was an illusion of safety she carefully maintained, unaware that stability in a slave's life was always a mirage, contingent on the whims of those holding absolute power. Addison Riverside, the colonel's eldest son, had recently returned from his studies in Natchez. At 22, he was a younger, harsher version of his father, sharing the same icy gaze but lacking the discipline that age brought. During college, he had developed a taste for diversions that involved exercising power over the defenseless. Celia had noticed how Addison observed her younger assistants, finding excuses to enter the kitchen when his father was absent. She kept the girls constantly busy under her watchful eye, yet she could not be everywhere, and Addison had all the time in the world. What Celia did not realize was that Addison had also noticed her children during their short visits to the kitchen. In his twisted mind, he began seeing them as opportunities for amusement he considered harmless. After all, they were children and slaves. He thought it natural they learn early about their place in the world. On hot summer afternoons, when fieldwork slowed, Addison wandered the property, devising cruel lessons to enforce hierarchy and obedience, games he deemed educational. Celia felt the tension in the quarters whenever Addison appeared. Mothers pulled their children closer, men lowered their eyes and worked harder, but she could not imagine that her own children would soon become the focus of the young master's attention. The Riverside plantation operated like a small kingdom with its unwritten laws and complex hierarchies. At the top was the colonel, then his family, followed by white overseers, and finally the slaves in their own internal layers. Celia had learned to navigate this system carefully, using her position as cook to protect her family as best she could. Yet protection, she would soon discover, was fragile, capable of vanishing in a single act of casual cruelty. Autumn 1848 arrived in Mississippi with deceptive beauty, painting oak leaves in gold and filling the air with the sweet scent of harvested sugarcane. It was Celia's favorite season, when kitchen work increased, preparing winter preserves and elaborate dinners celebrating abundance. One October morning, she rose before dawn as usual. The air was fresh, almost cold, and a thin mist blanketed the fields. She lit the kitchen fire and began preparing breakfast for the main house, her movements practiced after many years. Samuel had already left for the forge, and the children still slept deeply on their straw mattresses. The day promised to be special. The colonel had announced that he would host a group of neighboring planters interested in discussing crop techniques and potential trade partnerships. It was the type of occasion that required Celia's finest effort, a lunch meant to impress men used to elegant dining and convince them that Riverside was a thriving and well-kept property. Celia had designed the menu with careful attention: turtle soup with cherries, roasted duck with wild berry sauce, ham glazed with honey and mustard, sides of caramelized sweet potatoes, and green beans with almonds. For dessert, her famous bourbon pudding with vanilla cream, a recipe perfected over the years, which always drew compliments from guests. While overseeing her helpers, Celia allowed herself a brief moment of quiet pride. She had transformed the Riverside Plantation kitchen into a place that could rival the finest kitchens in Natchez or Vicksburg. Her work not only upheld the colonel's social standing but also offered some protection for her family. It was a delicate balance, one she had learned to manage with skill. Around 10 in the morning, Thomas, Mary, and David came into the kitchen, as they did when Celia needed to keep an eye on them. Thomas had fed the chickens in the quarters. Mary helped the older women gather eggs, and David, still too small for serious work, had simply tried to assist his older siblings. Celia gave them pieces of sweet bread left over from the main house breakfast and instructed them to remain near the kitchen where she could watch them. Celia laid down the rules as she always did. The children should stay visible. Thomas was to take care of his younger siblings, and David must not wander off. Thomas, serious and thoughtful like a miniature adult, nodded and accepted responsibility for his siblings. Celia watched them play in the small courtyard behind the kitchen, their laughter echoing in the morning air. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to dream of a different life for them. Perhaps Thomas could learn to read and write as she had. Perhaps Mary could use her knowledge of plants for something beyond daily survival. Perhaps David could grow up in a world where being black didn't automatically mean being someone's property. They were dangerous thoughts, she knew, dreams that could shatter a mother's heart, yet they were all she could offer her children, besides love and protection. The morning passed quickly in the preparations for lunch. Guests arrived at noon, well-dressed men coming on horseback or in simple wagons, speaking loudly about cotton prices and farming techniques. Celia could hear them from the other side of the dining room door as she carried the dishes, their voices confident and self-assured. The lunch was a complete success. She knew by the way the guests enjoyed each course and by the praise reaching the kitchen from the servants serving at the table. The colonel was clearly satisfied, and Rosalind even sent a message of congratulations through Sarah. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when Celia noticed she hadn't seen the children for some time. Normally they would appear around noon, asking for a snack, or simply to be near her. Their absence made her uneasy, but she reassured herself, thinking they were likely playing in the quarters and had lost track of time. It was Hannah who brought the first alarming news. She had gone to fetch firewood near the quarters and saw smoke coming from the old barn, the one no longer used to store hay, standing at the edge of the cotton fields near the slave quarters. Hannah ran into the kitchen, breathless, reporting thick smoke rising from the old barn. Celia's heart froze. The barn was close to where the children sometimes played when she wasn't watching. Without hesitation, she dropped the spoon she was using and ran for the door. She shouted to Sarah to handle the kitchen and ran across the fields. The smoke was visible in the distance, a black column climbing into the bright afternoon sky. Celia ran faster than ever before, her heart pounding in her chest. Other slaves noticed the fire and ran in the same direction, carrying buckets of water from nearby wells. When she reached the barn, the wooden structure was already engulfed in flames. The heat was overwhelming, almost unbearable, and the thick smoke made breathing difficult. But it was the sound that struck terror into her heart. Muffled screams came from inside, voices she instantly recognized. Celia screamed about her children being trapped inside, trying to reach the entrance. Strong arms held her back, preventing her from rushing into the inferno. Samuel had come running from the forge after spotting the smoke. He shouted that she would die if she went in, struggling to restrain her as she fought desperately. Others tried to get close, but the flames were too strong. The old dry wood burned like paper, and the roof had begun to collapse. The screams from inside grew weaker and then stopped completely. Celia sank to her knees in the dirt, a sound escaping her that was neither scream nor moan, but something deeper, primal. It was the sound of a soul breaking in two. It took nearly 2 hours to put out the fire entirely. When the remaining smoke cleared enough to enter, the 3 small bodies were found together in a corner where they had tried to hide. Thomas had shielded his younger siblings with his body, but it had not been enough. Later, it was discovered that the barn door had been locked from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the children before setting the fire, but who and why? Addison Riverside arrived about an hour later, claiming he had been riding in distant fields and only saw the smoke on his way back. He offered condolences for the loss of property and suggested it was likely an accident, perhaps children playing with matches. But Lily, one of the younger kitchen assistants, had seen Addison near the barn that morning. She had gone to gather herbs near the quarters and witnessed him talking with the children, laughing at something Thomas said. When she told Celia 3 days after the funeral, her words struck like a second death. Lily explained that Addison had been playing with the children, mentioning a new game they would enjoy. He had guided the children into the barn, promising a surprise. Celia said nothing. She simply nodded, continuing to peel potatoes for dinner. But inside, something had changed. Something had died with her children, and something else had been born in its place. That night, alone in her empty cabin, Celia made a choice. She would no longer be just Celia, the Riverside cook. From that moment, she became Celia Washington. She chose the surname of the first president, the man who had fought for his nation's freedom. She would fight for her own freedom, not escape, which would have been easy, but the freedom that came with justice. The freedom only realized when those who had taken everything from her paid the full price. Celia Washington began to plan. In the days after the funeral, she continued her routine in the kitchen, but at night, when everyone slept, she quietly left her cabin and walked to the place where her children had died. There, kneeling among the still smoking ruins, she made promises no human ear could hear. She whispered to the blackened ground about Thomas, Mary, and David, vowing she would remember and make the guilty pay. On moonless nights, she collected plants Mama Ruth had taught her to identify, plants that only grew where death had touched the earth, carrying secrets in their roots and leaves. The months after the children's deaths changed Celia in ways that none at Riverside could fully understand. Outwardly, she remained the meticulous, efficient cook, perhaps even more careful and devoted to details. But those who knew her noticed subtle shifts that unsettled them. Samuel noticed first. His wife's silence had grown different, deeper, more calculated. She spent hours awake, staring from her cabin window toward the main house with an unreadable expression. When he spoke of the future or the possibility of having more children, she responded as if he spoke a language she didn't know. Celia made it clear there was no future for her, only the present, and the present was all that mattered. In the kitchen, she made quiet changes. She insisted on preparing every dish for the Riverside table herself, not letting any assistant touch the food after she added the final seasonings. She claimed it was for quality, but Hannah noticed she stored certain herbs and spices in a locked cabinet that only Celia could open. When asked about these herbs, Celia simply said they were special ingredients for special occasions. What Hannah didn't know was that Celia had begun nighttime excursions into the swamps surrounding the plantation. Using the knowledge Mama Ruth had passed down, she collected plants that only grew in specific soils under precise conditions. Mushrooms that sprouted on rotting logs, vines that curled around dead trees, roots that could only be gathered during late autumn and early winter. Mama Ruth had taught her about these plants when she was young, always with stern warnings. Some were for healing illnesses that white doctors couldn't cure, and she would show dried leaves for that purpose. Others were meant for situations when healing was no longer possible, when only justice remained. Celia now fully understood the meaning of those words. During the winter of 1848, she began her experiments. She started with very small, almost imperceptible doses added to Addison Riverside's food. Nothing that could kill him, not yet. Just enough to bring discomfort, to make him question his own body. Unexplained stomach pains, bouts of nausea, nights of sleeplessness followed by days of heavy fatigue. Addison increasingly complained about his health. He consulted doctors in Vicksburg and even in Natchez, but no one could find a reason for his symptoms. Some blamed stress, others recommended changes in diet. One unusually sharp doctor even suggested avoiding heavily spiced foods for a while. Celia almost smiled when she overheard this advice. If only they knew that the problem wasn't the spices themselves, but the special ingredients she had added in secret. Meanwhile, she watched closely. She studied household routines, meal times, and each family member's food preferences. She discovered that the Colonel preferred rich, dark sauces, Rosalind liked light and delicate dishes, and Addison favored rare meats and strong flavors. More importantly, she learned of a major event the Riverside family was planning for early 1849. Pearl, the youngest daughter of the Colonel, had become engaged to Sylvester Thompson, son of a wealthy cotton planter from the next county. The wedding was set for late January, and it would be the social event of the season. Rosalind had been planning for months, consulting Celia almost daily about the wedding banquet. It would be a small, intimate gathering of close family and a few important relatives. The Riverside family's culinary reputation would be tested before those who mattered most. During one of these consultations, Rosalind stressed that the wedding had to be perfect, a family event everyone would remember. Celia promised it would be flawless, a promise she fully intended to keep. It would be perfect, carefully planned, executed with precision, and final. During the long winter nights, she refined her plan. She knew that simply poisoning the food would be too obvious. She wanted something subtler, more deliberate, a plan that delivered justice in the exact measure of each person's wrongs. She started compiling a list of all who would attend. Through eavesdropping, observing preparations, and reading letters, she mapped out the guests, the complete Riverside family, the Colonel, Rosalind, Addison, Pearl, and her younger brother Charles. The Thompson family, Sylvester's parents, 2 brothers and 1 sister. Some close uncles and cousins from both sides. 17 people in total. 17 lives that had benefited, directly or indirectly, from the system that had destroyed her children. 17 people who had never questioned the right to own others, to separate families, to treat children as property. For each name she discovered, she began planning a specific outcome. The Colonel, who had allowed his son to kill 3 innocent children and covered it up, would receive the main dish, literally and figuratively. Addison, the murderer himself, would face a slower, more agonizing fate. Rosalind, who had lived a life profiting from others' suffering without questioning it, would face confusion and fear, unable to understand what was happening. The others would receive lessons on the true costs of their wealth and comfort. Celia spent the rest of the winter perfecting her methods, not just the culinary recipes, but also the secret remedies and preparations Mama Ruth had taught her. She tested dosages, studied effects, and calculated action times. A key discovery was preparing special meals for the few children who would attend, the Thompson youngsters. They would receive sweet porridges and warm milk that would let them sleep through the banquet. Celia had no interest in harming innocents. Her justice was precise, aimed only at those responsible for wrongdoing. During her night trips into the swamps, she gathered plants with mild sedative properties so that the children would sleep peacefully while the adults paid for their families' sins. By spring of 1849, Celia Washington was ready. She had transformed from a grieving cook into someone far more dangerous, a woman with knowledge, strategy, and nothing left to lose. Pearl Riverside's wedding would be remembered, though not for the reasons her family expected. In her final weeks of preparation, Celia left subtle signs of her transformation. In her secret notebook, the same one where Mama Ruth had shown her the first letters, she recorded not only recipes but reflections on justice, on the cost of silence, and on what happens when patience runs out. One night by candlelight, she wrote that people thought themselves invisible, that their actions were forgotten, but they were the living memory of all their sins. Memory, when it speaks, echoes through time. Samuel noticed she had begun using the surname Washington in her notes. When he asked, she said she had chosen her own name and declared herself free to determine her own destiny. He did not fully understand, but the conviction in her voice made him decide not to ask further. January 27, 1849, dawned clear and cold, with frost dusting the cotton fields like powdered sugar. Pearl Riverside's wedding day had the plantation alive with activity before sunrise. Celia awoke at 3 a.m, as planned for months, not out of anxiety, but because her work required precision, perfect timing, and a calm she had cultivated over long months of preparation. The main house kitchen had become a command center. 3 ovens worked simultaneously. Massive pots bubbled over fires, and her 5 assistants moved in choreographed motions, each responsible for a specific task. Celia oversaw the most critical elements: seasonings, sauces, and the final touches on each dish. The menu was meticulously prepared as if for a battle. Fresh oysters from New Orleans served with mignonette sauce she made herself, turtle soup with cherry, a dish she had perfected over the years. The main course included roasted pork glazed with honey and mustard, smoked ham, roasted duck with cherry sauce, and sides that would make the guests remember the banquet for life, though, as Celia knew, some of them would not live long enough to forget. Guests arrived around noon, wagons and horses climbing the circular road toward the main house. Celia observed them discreetly through the kitchen window, recognizing the faces she had studied for months. The Thompson family patriarch, Colonel Wilfred Thompson, notorious for harsh discipline on his plantations, his wife, Matilda, infamous for separating slave families to prevent bonds, the 2 eldest sons, Seth and Randolph, reflecting their father's cruelty, the youngest daughter, Jeanette, already showing the same disregard for others as her family. 17 guests, each carrying their own guilt, each prepared for a lesson. The ceremony took place in the garden under a pavilion adorned with white flowers and silk ribbons. Pearl was radiant in a lace dress from Charleston. Sylvester Thompson stood nervously beside her, and Reverend Matthews, a large man who served many plantations, conducted the ceremony with his usual commanding voice. Celia watched from the kitchen window, overseeing the final preparations. The celebration of love and happiness seemed surreal to her, knowing what lay ahead, but she felt no remorse, only a cold, calculated satisfaction. When the ceremony ended and the guests entered the dining room, Celia gave a subtle signal to her assistants. It was time. The hall was decorated with the best the Riverside house could offer. Crystals reflected dozens of candle flames. The family silver shone brilliantly. Celia's plan was in motion, precise and unstoppable. The white linen tablecloth and the ornate floral arrangements filled the room with fragrance. Guests took their places around an oval table that dominated the hall, the newlyweds seated in the center and the most influential families arranged in positions of honor. Before the main banquet, something special had been prepared for the 3 children present, 2 young Thompson children and a Riverside niece. They were served sweet porridges flavored with honey and mild spices, alongside warm milk with a touch of vanilla. The children enjoyed the treats and soon began to yawn. Their mothers, believing it was just the natural tiredness from the day's excitement, took them upstairs to rest. Everything had been calculated perfectly. The children would sleep deeply for hours, safe from the events that were about to unfold. The first course went smoothly. The oysters were well received, and the cook noted with quiet satisfaction that even the most critical guests appeared impressed. Only a subtle amount of special seasoning had been used in this dish, just enough to begin the process and prepare the guests' digestive systems for what was to come. The turtle soup was an even greater success. Colonel Riverside rose to make a toast, praising the cook's skill, prompting applause from the guests. From the half-open kitchen door, the cook allowed herself a small, cold smile. It was during the main course that things became more deliberate. Weeks had been spent perfecting doses for each person. Colonel Wilfred Thompson received a generous portion of roasted pork, seasoned with a special mix of herbs collected during autumn and early winter. The effect would be gradual but unavoidable. First a rising warmth, then growing nausea, followed by convulsions and finally respiratory failure. Matilda Thompson, who had been known to separate families of slaves, received a dish containing a carefully calculated substance that would cause vivid and terrifying hallucinations before death. She would witness the suffering of the families she had torn apart, feeling their despair as if it were her own. The Thompson sons received dishes containing compounds designed to attack their nervous systems, causing a slow loss of coordination, eventually leading to paralysis. They would feel their bodies weakening, just as they had failed to protect those under their control. Addison received a particularly intricate combination of 3 different substances, each acting at a separate stage. First came intense abdominal pain, followed by loss of coordination, and finally paralysis that left him conscious but unable to move while his body gradually stopped working. The banquet continued for nearly 2 hours. Guests enjoyed each dish and praised the food lavishly. There were toasts to the newlyweds, speeches about family success, lively conversations about politics and business. The mood was one of genuine celebration and enjoyment. It was around 9 in the evening when the first symptoms appeared. Colonel Thompson was the first to show signs of sudden illness. He had just finished a speech on maintaining discipline on plantations when he suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach. His wife, sitting beside him, asked if he was all right, but before he could answer, she felt a burning sensation in her throat. Within minutes, the elegant hall descended into chaos. Guests stood abruptly, some running outside for fresh air, others collapsing in pain on the table. The sound of conversation gave way to moans and screams of panic. Addison tried to stand to help, but his legs refused to move. He looked down in confusion, unable to comprehend why his body wouldn't obey. His eyes met the cook's, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway to watch the results of her work. For a brief moment, they looked at each other across the chaotic hall. In that instant, understanding struck him, eyes widening in terror. But it was already too late. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. The cook watched him for a few more seconds, then turned calmly and returned to the kitchen. There were dishes to wash, evidence to destroy, and an escape to execute. But first, one last task remained. From her apron pocket, she withdrew a small piece of paper with a message written in her neatest handwriting. She placed it clearly on the kitchen table and left through the back door. The note read simply, "For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington." When the first neighbors and the local doctor arrived at Riverside Plantation the next morning, they found 17 bodies scattered throughout the dining hall, some still in their chairs, others fallen to the floor in twisted positions. There were no adult survivors. The 3 children were discovered sleeping soundly in an upper room, completely unharmed, with no memory of the night's events. Celia Washington had vanished into the darkness, taking only the clothes she wore and the satisfaction of seeing justice done. The discovery sent shockwaves through the South. 17 of Mississippi's most prominent citizens dead in a single night during what should have been a celebration of union and prosperity. Newspapers in Jackson, Natchez, and distant cities like Charleston and Richmond devoted full pages to what quickly became known as the Riverside Wedding Massacre. Authorities arrived at the plantation on January 28th, alerted by Samuel, who found the main house door open and an eerie silence inside. The Warren County Sheriff, Patrick Lambert, later described the scene as something out of Dante's worst nightmares. Bodies lay scattered in the elegant dining hall, showing extreme agony. Some had attempted to flee, found near doors and windows. Others had collapsed over the table, faces contorted in unbearable pain. Many still had their eyes open, as if conscious until the very end. Addison was found seated rigidly in his chair, eyes wide with terror. The examining doctor later said he had never seen fear so clearly preserved in death, as if Addison understood what was happening but was powerless to stop it. Investigators immediately considered mass poisoning, an obvious explanation, but determining the exact substances proved difficult. Each victim displayed unusual symptoms, as if poisoned individually with materials tailored to them. When they discovered the message in the kitchen, the true nature of the crime became evident. For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington. The words left a lasting impression on all who read them, a declaration both of confession and vengeance. Colonel Riverside, who had been away on business in Natchez during the wedding, returned immediately upon hearing the news. When shown the note, his face went pale. He knew precisely who Thomas, Mary, and David were and began to understand the scale of the event. He murmured to himself, questioning how a simple cook could orchestrate such a plan. But the cook had not been simple for a long time. She had become something far more formidable, a woman of knowledge, resolve, and a relentless drive for justice that had consumed her life. The search for Celia Washington began immediately. Descriptions were posted across Mississippi and neighboring states, and a $500 reward was offered for her capture, alive or dead, a large sum at the time, reflecting the fear and outrage her act provoked. Yet she had vanished like smoke. Some claimed to have seen her traveling rural roads to the north. Others swore she boarded a steamboat on the Mississippi River. Rumors suggested she might have been assisted by abolitionists, though nothing was ever proven. The reality was both simpler and more intricate. Celia had planned her escape with the same care she had applied to the poisoning. For months, she had hidden small caches of food and supplies along a carefully memorized route through Mississippi's swamps and forests. She avoided main roads and rivers, knowing authorities would search there first. Instead, she traveled along old hunting trails and hidden paths, moving mostly at night and resting during the day in prepared hideouts. Samuel was questioned extensively, but genuinely did not know her whereabouts. The changes in her after the children's death were shocking, but no one ever imagined she could plan something so detailed and devastating. When he saw the message she left behind, he wept, not just from grief, but from a mixture of pride, fear, and sorrow. He admitted that she had always been stronger than anyone thought, yet he never expected such an extreme act. The effects of the tragedy spread far beyond the riverside plantation. Planters across the South began viewing their own household slaves with new suspicion. Cooks, in particular, faced tighter scrutiny. Many wealthy families dismissed their slave cooks and employed free white workers instead, paying large sums for a sense of safety that may have been only imagined. Suspicion spread quickly, almost like a disease. Elaborate meals, once symbols of Southern wealth and hospitality, turned into tense affairs where hosts tasted each dish before serving it to guests. Some planters even hired professional tasters, echoing practices of ancient kings. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For the first time, the Southern elite had to face the truth. Slaves were not passive property, but humans with memory, emotion, and, most frighteningly, the ability to plan and carry out revenge. Celia Washington had shattered a core belief on which the entire system relied, the idea that obedience was natural and oppression could continue without consequences. 3 months after the event, a merchant reported seeing a black woman working on a small farm in Tennessee, a state where fugitive slave laws were not strictly enforced. The description vaguely resembled her, but authorities found no trace. Over the years, there were other reports in Kentucky, Ohio, and even Canada, but none were confirmed. Her ultimate fate remained unknown. Some believed she had died in the swamps during her escape. Others insisted she had reached freedom in the North or Canada. There were whispers that she might still be alive, living under a new name and helping others escape. What was clear was her legacy. Across slave quarters in the South, her name was spoken with both fear and respect. She had shown that even the most oppressed could resist, fight back, and demand justice. For slave owners, she became a constant nightmare, a reminder that their wealth rested on fragile and unstable foundations. Every meal became a test of trust, every cook a potential threat. And somewhere, perhaps on a small farm in Ohio, a modest house in Detroit, or wandering the streets of Boston, a woman who chose her own surname continued her life, no longer someone's property, no longer a victim, but as Celia Washington, a woman who proved that justice, even delayed, eventually arrives. The Riverside plantation never fully recovered from the massacre. The colonel attempted to rebuild, but the estate was seen as cursed. Free workers refused jobs there, and even slaves from neighboring plantations whispered stories about spirits haunting the fields. Eventually, the property sold for a fraction of its former value. The main house was torn down, the fields repurposed, but the memory endured, passed from generation to generation as a warning. Even under the harshest oppression, resistance finds a way. The 3 children who survived, the 2 Thompson children and the Riverside niece, grew up without a clear understanding of that night. Their adoptive families never told the full story, only that their parents had died in a tragic accident. Yet in their dreams, they sometimes heard the soft echo of a lullaby and woke with tears in their eyes, unsure why. He stayed in the area for a few more years, working as a free blacksmith after the plantation dissolved. He never remarried, but often visited the small cemetery where the children were buried. When he died in 1867, witnesses said his last words were a message for her, expressing understanding and forgiveness. The minister who had officiated the doomed wedding never conducted another ceremony without trembling. He fasted for 3 days before each event, convinced God was testing him through fear. He passed away 2 years later, some say from terror, others from guilt that consumed him. On cold winter nights in Mississippi, when the wind sweeps through the empty cotton fields, locals claim to hear a voice whispering through the darkness. Some say it is for the children, while others swear they hear firm footsteps on the road, a woman who chose her own path and refused to look back. Celia Washington's story is not just about revenge. It is a story of transformation, of a woman who refused to let her suffering be ignored and proved that justice, no matter how delayed, could be claimed. She demonstrated that even in the darkest times, some rise against injustice, pay the price for resistance, and choose freedom even at great personal cost. In one night, she turned a wedding into a court of justice, where 17 people faced consequences for the wrongs of a society built on oppression. Her act was more than personal revenge. It was proof that those considered property could think, remember, and demand accountability. Knowledge, when combined with determination and opportunity, can outweigh chains and whips. Her precision made the story even more striking. She did not kill randomly, but selected each victim according to their wrongdoing. Each death reflected the suffering they had caused, and in her final act, she spared the innocent children, showing that her actions were guided by principle, not anger. Over 170 years later, her story continues to resonate as a reminder that long-ignored injustice eventually finds correction. She was not just a grieving mother. She became the voice for those who suffered quietly. Her patience, her strategy, and her careful planning make her story remarkable. For months, she transformed pain into knowledge, anger into strategy, grief into resolve. Every spice added to the dishes that night carried the weight of generations of silenced suffering. Her story challenges us to consider justice, revenge, and the cost of systemic cruelty. Behind every system of oppression are human hearts capable of both pain and retaliation. Her decision to adopt the surname Washington was deliberate, a claim to identity and independence. In that act, she became the author of her own history. Her final fate remains unknown, and perhaps it is better that way. Her real triumph was not just escaping punishment, but proving that justice has many forms, sometimes served quietly, even on a porcelain plate, seasoned with the hidden herbs of the Mississippi swamps.